My husband was laughing with a woman on a patio when the school office called me about a missing tuition payment, and the message felt like a stone in my stomach. I opened our joint banking app and saw the transfer labeled Weekend Conference. I drove to his work site. Calm Steady asked for him and showed the screenshots while he blinked. I held out my palm and said keys and title now because our son goes to school today, not someday, and he set his jaw and tried a joke, and I did not smile. I walked to the parking lot, started his shiny motorcycle, heard the engine rise like a dare, and rode straight to the bursar window where I placed the keys, the signed title and the bill together, and said, Mark. The account paid in full. The clerk looked from me to the bike outside and nodded and stamped paid, and in that moment the knot inside my chest loosened, and I felt my spine return to its true height. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you're enjoying these stories of empowerment, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this amazing community. Let's dive in. I am a mother. I am a worker. I am a woman who keeps a blue binder by the kitchen phone with tabs for school medical utilities, mortgage, and warranties. The first page is a simple list that begins with smoke alarms and ends with taxes. I like simple lists that become action. I like receipts that tell the truth. I wake early, I boil rice, I iron uniforms, I label folders, I pin the school lunch schedule on the fridge. I drive a silver sedan with dents on the back bumper that I leave there on purpose because they remind me that our life is real and not a picture. And I have a son who is quiet and quick and makes small boats out of index cards and spins them across the tub at night. My husband used to be a man with a plan, or that is what he told me. A plan for a small shop, a plan for weekend rides, a plan for father and son, road trips after graduation. He liked the mirrors on the motorcycle, the way the chrome threw back the sky, and he liked the sound of his own voice. When he described open roads, he liked to say, "Trust me." And I did until the tuition notice arrived, and with it the trail of transfers and the photos of a bar with string lights, and a woman with sharp eyebrows and a red top, and a caption that read, "Late class." I did not shout. I set the rice cooker to keep warm. I stacked bowls. I made a second list, a simple one that said, "Find title, check lien print, bill call school," and at the bottom, "Return keys to the right place." By the time my son tied his shoes, I had called the school, asked for the bursar, and explained I could clear the term charge today with a vehicle title if the office could accept the transfer of ownership toward the balance. The clerk put me on hold, then returned with a supervisor voice that said, "We cannot accept property, but we can note a payment from the sale." I said, "Thank you," and I called a used motorcycle buyer who picks up with a flatbed and pays cash on the spot. I told him the model year, the mileage, and the add-ons, and he named a number that covered the bill with a slice to spare. I told him to bring the paperwork to the school address at noon. He agreed with a whistle that said, "Market is hot." I put my son in the car, drove him to class, kissed his hair and said, "You are covered." Then I went to my husband's job. The front desk smelled like coffee and toner. I asked for him. The man at the desk paged him, and he came out with an easy smile that slid away when he saw my binder. I said, "We need the motorcycle right now." And he said, "It is mine." And I said, "The tuition is ours, and the transfer was yours, and the replacement is mine." He tried to lead me to a corner to talk softly, and I stood where I was, so everyone could hear the truth. Money for school went to a hotel and a patio, and a bright red drink. So today the bike pays for the fall term, and my husband called me dramatic, and I said I am exact. And I held out my hand, and he stared at my hand like it was a mirror he did not want to face, and then he handed me the keys and the envelope with the title because I had already texted him a photo of the buyer, confirmation, and the school bill and the record of his transfers. He knew the math. He knew I was done with stories. I drove the bike to the school. The sun felt like a warm coin on my back, the mirrors through the sky, the engine hummed. I parked by the curb. The buyer arrived in a truck with straps and a clipboard. He walked around the bike and said clean lines. I signed the paper. He counted cash, and I took it inside the office where the bursar counted again and printed paid in full, and I slid the receipt into the blue binder and breathed my first true breath of the day. This is the part where people expect me to cry or shake. I did. Neither. I stacked the copies, asked the clerk to email an official zero balance letter, and then I walked out and watched the truck pull away with the bike. And I felt nothing but relief, because a tool had become a ticket for someone else. And for us, it had become a debt. I drove home in the silent sedan, looked at the empty space in the driveway where he always posed for photos, and in that empty space, I felt a calm square of ground where I could stand upright. The problem did not end with the payment. The problem began to show its real shape. The problem was not a motorcycle or a bill. The problem was a string of small lies that had been braided into something thick and sticky. The problem was the way he said, "Trust me," while moving money between accounts. The way he put our son third behind his hobby and a woman who called herself a friend in his phone. My world had been tidy, and now it had smudges, grease on white towels, and I understood that order would need new rules, so I made rules. Rule 1, separate accounts. I told him that night at the table, I said, "We will not share if you cannot protect what we share." And he rolled his eyes and said, "This is extreme." And I said, "The school is paid with metal and regret, and that is extreme enough." Rule 2, written budgets, not speeches. Rule 3, we meet with the bank to remove your access to the education fund, and we add my sister as backup custodian. Rule 4, you attend a meeting at the school with me to apologize to the bursar for the delay. He tried charm. He tried a grin. He tried a story about a mix-up. And I looked at him until his grin fell off his face like a sticker that has lost its glue. He said, "Fine," but there was a flinty tone under the word, and I marked that tone in my mental ledger. The next day, he wove a new line about a bonus coming soon, and a plan to replace the bike and take our son on a ride. I said our son rides in a helmet of books, and that is final. He said, "I am not a bad father," and I said, "A good father pays tuition before tips and toys." The nemesis in my life was not a single woman. It was a way of life, where he floated and I carried weight. It was the story he told about himself, the hero of speed and open road, and the story he told about me, the clerk who stamps his route. He did not like that I had used his machine to feed our child. He sent a flurry of texts to friends about betrayal, and the group chat hummed like insects. I turned off notifications and printed the zero balance letter and taped it inside the binder front cover where it could glow like a lighthouse. I began to solve the larger problem by changing small habits. I moved the education fund to a new credit union in my name, only as custodian, and the banker nodded and slid forms across the desk. I froze the joint credit card with the press of a button. I set the app to alert me for any large transfer from our household account. I created a new account for household expenses funded by my paycheck and a fixed contribution from him, due every Friday at noon, if not received by end-of-day utilities, would move to my name only, and he would transfer me the said amount. He scoffed. I did not respond. I wrote each rule down in the binder and left a copy on the fridge door. The first hurdle came when Friday arrived and no transfer came. I sent a simple note at noon, "The amount is due by end of day," and he replied with a selfie from a diner and a line about a long meeting. I did not argue. I packed away the mixer he liked to use for his weekend protein shakes, and I put a note on the pantry door that said "Budget on hold until household funding resumes by 5." He sent the transfer. The second hurdle was a visit from a man with a smooth voice who said he had seen my husband on the patio and meant no harm. He just wanted to make sure I knew we are only friends. I stood in our doorway and said, "The school is paid and my family is not open to your visits." The third hurdle was my own fear that I had become hard. I would lie awake and stare at the ceiling and hear the faint echo of the motorcycle like a memory. And I would ask myself if calm can be a shield, and yes, it can. Yes, it must. The original problem grew because he began to see me as an obstacle to the life he wanted, which was to be adored without duty. He took cash from his jacket pocket. More often, he left early and returned late. He cleaned his phone history and smiled about detox I documented without comment. Every odd transfer, every missing receipt, every claim of owed reimbursement. I kept copies in the binder and in a folder at my sister's house. The more the truth lined up in quiet rows, the more I could feel a low point approaching like a storm that has not yet broken. The school called again after a week to ask for a signature on a form, and the clerk thanked me again for the prompt payment and said gently, "We see this more than you think." And that sentence settled in my chest like both comfort and warning. I met with our son's teacher to make sure he did not feel the waves under our floor. I told her, "Switch the emergency contact order so calls go to me first." I told my son we will keep our routines and that adults fix adult messes, and he nodded and went back to his paper boats. The lowest point crept in on a quiet evening when I found a second prepaid phone in a toolbox wrapped in an oil rag. The phone contained messages about a weekend away and a code name for me that turned my stomach. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the dull screen and felt a heavy quiet press on my ribs. Not because of love gone thin, but because of trust gone empty. All may be lost is a phrase that sounds like thunder, but in real life it is a thin hiss of air from a tire you thought was solid. I felt that hiss and I did not cry. I wrote a new list. Sell the remaining gear, cancel the extra storage unit, pull the garage opener code, change the locks only after legal consult, and then I made tea and slept on the couch. Because the bed felt like a stage. He came home late and did not see me in the dark. He walked past me with the glow of the second phone in his palm, and I closed my eyes. I decided to make a final attempt that would not look like a fight. It would look like a ledger. It would look like a meeting. It would look like the opposite of the patio show. I scheduled an appointment with a family lawyer to understand rules about property and custody and accounts. I brought the binder, the zero balance letter, the proof of transfer, the prepaid phone photos. The lawyer listened and said, "Your position is strong, but your goal determines the path." I said, "My goal is security for my child and peace in my home." And the lawyer nodded and drew a simple flow on a notepad that showed separation of finances written agreements and a timeline to boundary enforcement with a final box labeled "Decide." I left the office with a calm heat in my shoulders, a heat that comes from lifting weight with proper form. I was not here to punish. I was here to set the ground true. The next hurdle was getting him to any table where words matter. He prefers motion and noise where accountability slips. But I found a way. I booked a session with a financial counselor at our credit union. A neutral room with a whiteboard and a patient man with a short haircut and a quiet pen. He agreed to come because he wanted to plead his plan for a new bike deal. I brought my binder. The counselor asked us to list our top 3 financial priorities. Mine were school housing health, his were new bike later travel and savings for a shop. The counselor wrote both lists, then circled school housing health, and asked, "Do you both agree? These must come first." My husband shifted but said yes. Then the counselor asked him to explain the transfer that removed the tuition, and my husband talked in loops about timing and mistakes. And I handed the counselor a printed series of statements in date order. The counselor read, and then placed the papers side by side with our priorities, and said, This does not align. The room was quiet in that clean, bright way that exposes fog, and my husband looked at me as if I had done something to him by telling the truth. I felt the low point in the set of his jaw. I felt the cliff edge where he could turn toward us or away from us. I did not beg. I said, "Here are the rules of our house, effective now. Household account fixed contribution each week. Education fund protected phone. Passcodes shared or no phones in the house. Prepaid device. Surrendered spare key returned. Any new vehicle purchase requires my written approval until all debts are paid, and a 6-month streak of on-time household payments is recorded." He said, "You cannot tell me what to do." And I said, "I can tell you the terms under which I live. I can tell you the line on the ground." And he laughed without sound, and the counselor wrote the terms on the whiteboard and asked, "Do you agree?" He would not say yes. He would not say no. He just stared past both of us and told a long story about a man who needs the road. I packed. My binder stood up and said, "Then the road can have you and the house will have order." He did not follow me out of the room at home. I gathered the last of his motorcycle gear gloves, boots jacket, and placed them in a box by the door with a simple note that said, "The bike paid the bill. The gear will pay for books." I listed the items for sale with clear photos and fair prices. Buyers messaged within minutes. The first pickup happened that same evening, and the cash slid into an envelope marked "School Extras." My son did homework at the table while I checked books off an online list. We are not rich. We are exact. Exact is a kind of wealth. He texted me a photo of a glossy bike on a showroom floor and wrote "soon," and I did not reply. I folded laundry. I labeled a folder tax year. I deleted the patio photos from my phone because I did not need them to remember my line. I only needed the binder, the receipts, and my calm voice. The house grew quiet like a library where learning returns. And to keep that quiet, I changed small things. I moved his trophies from the living room shelf to a bin in the closet. I filled the empty space with school art. A clay boat with a tilted mast. I taped a map of the city bus lines to the fridge. I placed a jar by the door labeled "field trip," and we fed it with spare coins on the nights when the house creaked like it was remembering noise. I would place my palm on the blue binder and breathe slow, and I would picture the bursar stamp paid and the mirror of the motorcycle catching sky. And I would let that image pass like a cloud, because symbols come and go, and what stays is food, rent, school, and rest in Act 1. My world was neat, then shaken in Act 2. I began to solve. I failed. I adjusted the stakes. Rose and the ground showed its true slope. I landed at a low point with a prepaid phone wrapped in oil, and a husband who loves the idea of himself more than the work of us. And yet I was not broken. I was a woman with a binder and a spine and a boy who needed lunch and books. The next part of this story will hold the move that turns the line into a wall and the wall into a door, and behind that door, a room where my son can grow straight toward the light, and I can stand without bending for anyone who confuses love with taking. I woke before dawn and made rice and eggs and packed a simple lunch and placed the blue binder on the table like a quiet flag, and I wrote a clean line across a sheet that said "Final Attempt," and under that I wrote 3 steps: sign the agreement, restore the fund show proof, and I printed a post-nup draft the lawyer had prepared in plain language. It said "School first, housing second, health third." It said "No secret accounts, no secret devices, no secret trips." It said if any term is broken, then separation begins and support is automatic, and the man at the bank issues wage assignment without further talk. And it said any vehicle, no matter how shiny, is not to be bought until 6 months of steady compliance are recorded. I made a copy for him and one for a notary at the credit union, and I set an appointment for noon. He came down the hall and looked at the binder like it was a wall and said, "We are still doing this." And I said, "Yes, today." And he shrugged and grabbed a mug and said, "You will not leave." And he said that, like a charm. And I said, "I will stay if you honor our home and our child." And he smirked faint and put the mug in the sink and said, "We will see." I walked our son to the car and we drove in silence. Not heavy, silence, calm silence. I left him at school with a wave and a nod to the guard. Then I drove to the credit union and sat in the small room with the notary who had soft eyes and a direct way of sliding forms across the table. He arrived late with the second phone gone from his pocket, but something new in his face that looked like a dare. The counselor from last time had left a small stack of blank budget sheets, and I placed them next to the post-nup and said, "We can do this. Quiet and clear now." And he leaned back and said, "You are making me the bad guy." And I said, "No. You are making choices and documents help us see them." And he stared at the ceiling like there was a map up there. And then he reached for a pen. He signed his name on the first page. He paused at the line about secret devices and said, "This is childish." I said, "Secrets are childish." And he looked at me sharp, and then he signed again. He reached the line about wage assignment, and he lifted the pen and set it down and lifted it again, and finally placed the tip to the page and made the long curve of his name. The notary stamped the last page and said, "You both now have a map. Please follow it." I felt no victory. I felt balance return, like a picture frame, set level on a nail. We left the building and the sun was high and he said, "Fine. Now can we stop acting like enemies?" And I said, "We were never enemies. We were careless now. We are careful." He left in a rush and I drove to work and did my tasks and kept my phone face down, so my mind stayed clear in the afternoon. The first test came. The bank app chimed a transfer out of the household account, a round number labeled gear storage. I opened the paper ledger later and matched the figure to a storage unit bill for his motorcycle parts that I had already closed last week with a final payment and a signed release. So this new transfer was not to storage, it was to himself. I sent a simple line under the rules. You agreed to no transfers without notice. The money must be returned by 5. The app showed nothing until 4:58. When the same amount came back with a note credit, he sent me a selfie from a parking lot with a grin that tried to say, "See, everything is fine." I did not respond. I printed the screens and tucked them into the binder that night. He stood in the doorway and said, "We are good now, right?" And I said, "We are following the map." And he said, "You love that map?" And I said, "I love the child who needs that map." The next days were quiet, and then a new wrinkle rose like a bubble in paint. His boss called me. He rarely calls me. He said, "Your husband came late 3 days running and left early. 2 days." He said he asked for an advance and was denied, and he was unhappy. I thanked the boss for letting me know, and I wrote in the binder that the wage assignment may be needed soon, and I placed the post-nup copy under that note. He came home with a plastic bag and a new jacket that smelled like rubber and ShopLite, and my stomach tightened because rubber smelled like riding and roads, and I said, "Is that new?" And he said it was a gift, and I looked at the seams and the tag still attached, and I said, "From who?" And he said, "The shop," and I said, "Shops do not deliver gifts." And he looked through me and walked past. I wrote down jacket, new tag, gift story. I did not fight about a jacket. I kept the line on the ground. I sold more of the old gear online. I pressed cash into the field trip jar and into an envelope for a lab fee and into a small kitchen fund for a new pot because the old one had a wobble in its base, and each time I placed a bill where it belonged, I felt the house steady itself like a boat catching good wind. Another test came fast. He sent a message during work hours. "Need the binder for a financing application." I answered no and added a line. "The binder does not leave the house, and all applications must be discussed first." He replied with a photo of a dealer, floor rows of chrome and light like water on glass. I did not respond one night. I found a receipt under a pile of mail for a down payment. It was small but real, and the date was yesterday. I stood in the kitchen and the air felt thin. I took a steady breath, placed the receipt in a clear sleeve labeled breach. Then I opened my phone and typed the name of the lender and the account number on the receipt and the postnup clause that required my consent. And I messaged the lender portal support stating that an application had been made without spousal consent contrary to our agreement, and that any lien or title would be contested. I attached the notarized page the next morning. A woman from the lender called and asked to verify my identity. I answered her questions. She read the clause and she said, "We can hold this application and we can flag any title until we receive either mutual consent or a court order." I thanked her calm and clear. Then I sent him a short line. "Your application is on hold," and a photo of the page, with his signature. He did not reply for an hour and then sent a single word, "childish." He came home with storm in his shoulders and said, "You are ruining my life." And I said, "I am protecting our child and our home." He said, "You are making moves behind my back." And I said, "The postnup is between us, and the binder is our record. And you had a choice at noon on signing day." He paced, and then he threw the new jacket on a chair and slammed the bedroom door, and the house shook. And my son looked up from homework, and I smiled at him and said, "It is okay. Finish the math problem. We will do the snack next day." The lender called again and said the application has been withdrawn. I logged the call and placed the note behind the breech sleeve, and then something odd happened. His boss called again and asked if he was okay because he had taken a long lunch and then returned, empty-handed and quiet. I said he will be fine, and hung up and sat in the car and breathed. I could feel the final turn approaching like the crest of a hill. You cannot see over you. Just know the road. Drop soon. The next morning in the driveway, there was a new motorcycle. Not new. New, but new to him. Black with gray stripes and no license plate. Yet, the sight was a cold stone in my throat. I walked around it and saw a dealer tag tied with string. I took a photo. I did not touch it. I went inside and he was by the sink. He said, "Do you like it?" And I said, "It violates our agreement. And you know that." And he said, "It is temporary. A friend's bike." And I said, "The tag says otherwise." I opened the binder to the clause and placed it on the counter. And he looked away and said, "We can work it out." And I said, "We will work it out with documents and phones." He reached for charm again, and it slid off the counter and clattered to the floor. We stood there in the simple kitchen with the simple light. And then the doorbell rang. A man stood on the step in a dark polo with a clipboard and a flat tone. He said, "I am here to recover a vehicle due to insurance hold and incomplete documents." And my husband blurted, "This is a mistake." And the man looked at his clipboard and said, "Plate none. VIN ended in these numbers." I matched the photo and nodded. The man asked for keys. My husband stalled. The man walked to a tow truck parked at the curb. I did not speak. I let the road do what roads do. The tow truck took the bike away, and quiet fell like snow. He turned to me and said, "This is your fault," and I said, "Your choices are your own, and consequences are the teacher's." We refused for too long. He left the house and slammed the door. And my son and I ate toast and peanut butter, and I wrote field trip on the calendar in big letters that looked like light. He stayed gone that night, and I slept well, because absence can be cleaner than chaos in the morning. I called the lawyer and asked to move the plan to the next box. The one labeled, "Decide," the lawyer said, "You have a clear breach and a clear path. We can file for legal separation. We can lock the education fund further. We can set temporary orders for support." I said, Do it without drama. Do it like math. The papers were filed that week. Quiet and neat. The wage assignment triggered a letter from the credit union payroll department to his employer. He received a copy and sent me a stream of messages that were all heat and no content. I did not respond. I kept moving exact in small circles that built a strong room. I changed the house locks after the papers were served, and after I confirmed with the lawyer that I must allow him. Scheduled access to collect personal items but not at will. I sent him a calendar line for Saturday at 10, with my sister present, and he replied with dots, and nothing else. Saturday came. He arrived with a cardboard grin and tried to make a scene, and my sister stood beside me like a fence. He took clothes and a box of old trophies. He asked about the bike that had paid the bill, and I said, "It is a receipt." He left, and the house exhaled. He tried one more angle. He called the school and told the office he would pay the next term directly. The clerk followed the note on file that said all financial discussions go to me first. She called me, and I said thank you, and I sent in an early deposit from the education fund that he could not touch. The bursar sent a new receipt stamped early paid, and I taped it inside the binder beside the first one like two strong bricks. The boss called again a week later. He said, "Your husband is missing shifts. He may be let go." I thanked him and logged the call. And then I sent my husband a clean line. "Please propose a schedule with our child that you can meet consistently, and propose a pickup spot. Public, well lit, and close to home." He sent back a workable plan, Sundays at 3. The library, I said, approved. I packed a small bag each Sunday with a snack and a water bottle, and a note for our son that said, "You are loved and you are safe." And we are steady on one Sunday. He did not show. I waited with our son, and at 3:20, I told our boy, "We are going home," and we bought ice cream on the way, and we watched a documentary about boats and their sails, and when the phone buzzed hours later, I did not reply. I wrote a line in the binder, "Missed pickup," and I moved on. The consequence of his choices looked different than he expected. He had thought I would yell or chase or plead, but I did not. I built a room. I set a line, and then I turned that line into a wall and then a door, and I stepped through it, and on the other side, there was not victory music, there was warm light and a calendar that served our life. I took a second job on Saturday mornings at a small bakery nearby because I liked the smell of early bread, and the extra money went into a small future fund for our son. Not large, steady. I joined a parent group that meets at the school once a week, and I found voices like mine, calm, bright. Sure, we traded tips on forms and scholarships, and how to keep routine when winds are loud, and in that circle I felt my spine hold its true height. One afternoon I stood at the curb and my son came out with a paper boat he had made in art class. The mast straight, the hull. Even he said it floats longer now, and I said yes, because the folds are exact. And he grinned, and I felt a simple joy that is not a firework. It is a steady flame at home. I took down the empty hooks where the helmet used to hang, and I put up a small shelf for books. Books about rivers and bridges and simple machines, and the clay boat moved to that shelf like a flag on a new border. Sometimes neighbors asked what happened to the motorcycle, and I said it paid school, and their eyes widened and then softened, and they said, "Good," and then they told me stories of their own, not all the same, but all with that moment where someone drew a line and kept it straight. The months turned without grand events. I kept the binder exact. The wage assignment ran the pickup schedule stabilized or it did not. And I adjusted without drama. The lender never called again. The dealer tag never returned. The secret phone no longer showed up in drawers. Our house found the rhythm of homework, dinner, reading, bed. My son learned to make rice. He learned to tie a better knot. He learned that care is not noise. It is follow-through. One evening he asked, "Will Dad ever ride with me?" And I said, He can ride in a bus with you to the museum. If he shows up for it, we can invite him." And my son nodded and said, "Okay," and went back to his drawing. The unexpected twist arrived in a small envelope from the school foundation. It said, a donor had covered a grant for students whose parents showed strong engagement, and our family was selected for a small extra tuition credit because of consistent forms and early payments. I read the letter twice. Then I laughed quiet, a small, true laugh that sounded like a window latching closed against wind. I pinned the letter behind the binder cover and wrote the word Grace on a sticky note and placed it there too. My husband tried one last display. He borrowed a friend's bike and revved it outside our house early one morning as if sound could shake the walls, and I opened the door and stood on the step. And he saw me and cut the engine, and the street went still, and I said, "Stop." And he looked at the ground and said, "Okay." And he rolled away. Later, he sent a message. "I am selling the rest of my gear to pay down my debts." And I replied, "Good luck." And that was all. The end did not shout. It settled. The house settled. My mind settled, and the binder stayed blue and strong on the shelf by the kitchen phone, where the first page is still a simple list that begins with smoke alarms and ends with taxes. And now between those lines there are notes that say school first field trip jar and Sunday library, and a new line that says peace on purpose. As for my future, it looks like a steady road, not of chrome and mirrors, but of pavement that holds and lines that guide. I will take my son to a museum, and we will stand in front of a boat with real sails, and we will talk about lift and drag and why a good keel keeps you upright in rough water. And when we go home, we will eat rice and eggs and laugh about small things, and he will sleep sound. And I will sit by the window and thank the quiet for teaching me how strong it is. And if someone asks me what became of the motorcycle, I will answer the same way each time it paid for school, and we kept the receipt. And that is a story I can live in with my head held level and my feet on ground that is finally mine.